The farther back we peer into the history of China, the less it becomes a reflection of reality, and the more it becomes a mythologized portrait. Documented history eventually and imperceptibly blends together with legend, without a clear demarcation line between the two, until at some point we arrive firmly in the realm of mythology. This period is a sort of mythological founding age, known in Chinese as 三皇五帝, or the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors. In this video, we'll focus just on the 3 sovereigns and discuss the 5 emperors another day, the first of whom was the Yellow Emperor, to whom I've devoted an entire video. Sovereign in Chinese is represented by the character Huang. In the ancient Chinese, the top half of Huang was a light, and the bottom half a light stand. This character doesn't appear, or at least hasn't been found, in the earliest discovered Chinese script, the Shang oracle bones. Emperor in Chinese is represented by the character Di. It seems to be a more ancient character than its sovereign counterpart, because it does appear in the older Shang oracle bone script. Its original shape depicts a wooden frame that was probably used during sacrificial offerings to the sky. Translating it into emperor is a little bit misleading and in some ways anachronistic, because the 5 emperors weren't really emperors, and there wasn't yet an empire. They were more like kings or tribal leaders of a coalition of tribes. Later, the emperor of the first true Chinese empire would take both of these characters, Huang and Di, and put them together in a way that suggested he was both an earthly and a heavenly ruler in one person. That combination of Huang Di coincides more with what we usually understand the word emperor to mean. With all of this in mind, we can finally ask, who actually were the 3 sovereigns? Well, the answer changes depending on who you ask. A different ancient book is going to give you a slightly different answer, sometimes a very different answer. The ancient sources don't often agree much on this point, and sometimes not at all. In the records of the Grand Historian, written by Sima Qian in 94 BC, it's recorded that the 3 sovereigns were the vaguely named Heavenly Sovereign, Tian Huang, Earthly Sovereign, Di Huang, and the Human Sovereign, Ren Huang. If, however, we take another ancient text as our reference, say the Shang Shu Da Zhuan, then we get a very different list of sovereigns, namely Sui Ren, inventor of fire, Fu Xi, inventor of animal domestication, cooking, and writer of the I Jing, or as we say it in the West, the I Ching, and Shen Nong. Other texts change the list yet again, substituting Sui Ren with Nu Wa, a goddess who created the human race. The multiplicity of these contradictions is something observed and discussed by Chinese people throughout history. Just look at these posts on the internet asking for help about who the 3 sovereigns really are after all. Were the 3 sovereigns Fu Xi, Shen Nong, Sui Ren? How are they also the heavenly sovereign, earthly sovereign, and human sovereign? This article says, the 3 sovereigns finally get a clear explanation. The 3 sovereigns, who actually were they? Fu Xi of the 3 sovereigns, was he really the heavenly sovereign or the human sovereign? This problem was even brought up in the 8th century AD during the Tang Dynasty by a historian named Sima Zhen, who wrote a book called the Bu Shi Ji, which can be translated as repairing the historical record, or even mending it or patching it. He recognized the contradictions in the ancient sources and listed the 3 sovereigns as Fu Xi, Nu Wa, and Shen Nong once and for all as the standard version. All of the personalities in these variations have their own storytelling traditions, personalities, and appearances, some of which don't often fit together with the way they're associated together. For example, stories about the heavenly sovereign say that he had 12 heads and lived to be 18,000 years old, and seemed to be a kind of primordial deity who was around right after the invention of the universe. Fuxi, with whom he is sometimes associated, on the other hand, was born from a goddess named Huaxu, after she stepped in the footprint of a thunder god and gave birth to a boy with the body of a snake. In any case, what appears to be happening here is a coalescing of oral traditions, which developed independently from one another, but perhaps not wholly disconnected. Later, when ancient writers sat down to write their chronicles and histories, they wrote down the version available to them, or tried to combine different competing variations into one uniform narrative, despite contradictions. Western mythology is prone to a similar kind of conflation. When Romans colonized other places, they introduced Greek gods there, but if that place already had a sun god, they didn't try to figure out which sun god was the right one. They just assumed they were both the same god under a different name, and their stories would get mashed together. This sometimes even happened to Greek gods who were similar to each other, for example, Apollo and Helios, who were both solar deities and eventually became conflated. When we look at the attempt to historicize contradictory strands of Chinese mythological traditions, perhaps we could understand these contradictions as arising from the same impulse to find cohesion between differing regional versions. This probably bothered people less in the past, especially in pre-literate societies, because when something isn't written down, we don't tend to attach too strongly to the idea of a definitive version. As soon as we write it down, however, we expect the story to be somehow finalized. So when events contradict, we get troubled, and we want to find a way to untangle the contradictions. In this case, we might never do so. So, who were the three sovereigns? Well, maybe it's best not to ask that question. Perhaps rather than trying to understand them as some vaguely remembered historical memory, we should see them as historical processes, mythologizing society's transition from pre-literate hunter-gatherers into the settled farming communities that eventually became the China we know today.